Go ahead and get started. I've got 11:15, so thanks everybody for making it on Friday. Thanks to everybody online who's joining us. I'm really pleased to introduce Bobby Davis today. Bobby lives in Hiwassee, Georgia. Just drove over for the seminar today, so really appreciate it. To give you a little background on his academic track record, he received his Bachelor of Science from Mansfield University. That's in Pennsylvania. They actually have a really strong program in fisheries biology for the undergrads there. A lot of hands-on experience. And a really strong historical program that's existed for a long time at Mansfield. So he did his undergrad there. Then he went for his master's degree at Ohio State. He actually worked with Mijeka Sullivan, who was the former director of the Baruch Center here, before Mijeka's untimely passing. Bobby completed his master's with Mijeka at Ohio State. Then after completing his master's, he actually worked for the World Wildlife Fund in Washington, D.C., before returning to Auburn University for his PhD in fisheries and aquatic sciences. Some of the work he's going to be presenting today came out of that work at Auburn University. After receiving his PhD, Bobby moved to Wisconsin, where he held a postdoctoral position for both the Wisconsin Cooperative Fishery Research Unit and the Wisconsin Stevens Point and Center for Limnology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's kind of a joint postdocs with 3 different organizations there, if that's right. And then currently he's assistant professor of biology, where he just started recently at Young Harris College, which is just about 2 hours from here across the mountains in North Georgia. So glad to have Bobby back in our neck of the woods, and appreciate you for taking the time to come over to give today's seminar.
All right, thank you for the introduction, Troy. So when Dr. Farmer and my friend, longtime friend, Jesse Kreiner asked me to come and present, I really thought about like what would be interesting, and I thought about something that might be different. So I put together this talk. Some of this work I've never gotten to present on because of the timing and because most of this was done during COVID. So I'm really excited to share this with you today. It's kind of a broad overview of the research I did while I was with WWF in Auburn. It was a unique situation. We got a grant at WWF, and essentially while I was working there, my boss at the time came to me and said, you can either do this here, you can do it at Auburn. If you do it at Auburn, you'll get your PhD. So all the work I did at Auburn was in conjunction with and for WWF. A lot of people to recognize, this is basically like all the WWF teams. This work occurred in like 5 or 6 countries. And so we had a lot of help from field crews in those countries. So I have to mention those people. We had field offices in Indonesia, Vietnam, and Ecuador that contributed to this project, and then 2 consultants in India that helped us. I also want to shout out my lab at Auburn. Dr. Boyd is currently like 84 years old. He was like 78 when he took me on. So Dr. Davis took me in like a stray dog off the street, and he was my advisor. So I'm really grateful for him. And then the Moore Foundation funded the work, so I should shout them out. Before I get into a lot of stuff about shrimp, I do want to say, like, to borrow from our famous philosopher Shrek, I'm like an onion, I have many layers. And so the last 4 years I've been in Wisconsin really working on walleye and perch populations. So I have a bunch of several publications that recently came out about walleye ecology. This publication has to do with kind of the role that aquatic macrophytes may or may not play in walleye reproduction. In this study, this was really cool. I got to kind of write up this study. It was a master's student work, and they took adult walleye and they took genetics from them and figured out who was making babies in the young of year. So we were able to track individual walleye fry or offspring into parents and look at kind of the demographic traits that were leading to successful reproduction. And then the project that I was actually being paid to do was kind of like a region-wide assessment of factors that were influencing stocking success. So that's kind of more nuts and bolts fisheries management stuff. So if that's more your bag, go check out those papers. I think they're pretty cool. So this figure's a little dated at this point. This data is from 2017, but the same kind of basic principle holds. The world's fisheries, if you look at this graph, these blue shaded regions are kind of the global fisheries catch. Fisheries plateaued sometime in the early 90s and has been roughly consistent since then. And so in order to meet the needs of consumers, or in order to grow the seafood markets, we really relied on aquaculture. And so you can see aquaculture wasn't really a major player in seafood until about the early 90s. So been this massive expansion in aquaculture. And because of that, there's been this kind of hand-wringing and concern about the environmental impacts that aquaculture can have. And so WWF became interested in aquaculture kind of in the late 90s. Dr. Boyd worked with Dr. Jason Clay, who's a kind of a thought leader at WWF, and they wrote this review. And he basically came to the conclusion that when it comes to shrimp, both wild-caught shrimp and cultured shrimp have impacts, but we can do more about the impacts of cultured shrimp, and so we should really work on that topic. And so when we think about aquaculture, there's a wide variety of impacts that aquaculture can have on the environment, but they can be kind of boiled down into some really basic kind of building blocks. So thinking about the takes land to grow fish, whether that be at the farm or in the feeds. It takes water, it takes energy. Those three factors really influence local and remote habitats. And then it also takes wild fish. So most trout or most trout feed or fish feed has some sort of wild fish component in it, which can affect biodiversity. And so the reason WWF is really interested in food production from a conservation standpoint, because about 40% of the human's land footprint is bound up in our food production. About 70% of our water use is bound up in food production, and about 25% of our greenhouse gases. So if we can tackle these issues in food, we can make big impacts on conservation. My particular kind of lead into this world or what I'm going to present started with this expose that The Guardian did in 2014. So in 2014, The Guardian came out with this pretty groundbreaking piece of journalism. Essentially, they tracked these boats that were being used in like the Gulf of Thailand to procure fish for shrimp feeds. And these boats were using what amounts to like indentured servants. These migrant workers were coming to Thailand. They were being taken onto these boats and their paperwork was being taken from them. And then they were trapped on these boats and forced to work in like a form of indebted servitude. And so what The Guardian did is they tracked individual shipments of fish from these boats to processing plants where they're rendered into fish meal, to feed plants where they're turned into shrimp food, to farms, and they tracked them all the way into supply chains that were ending up in places like Europe and the US. And so some states in the US have laws about not having indentured servitude or slavery in your supply chains. And so a lot of these big retailers, big grocery stores got sued over this. And so it sort of created this impetus for change. So out of this environment, a group emerged that became known as the Seafood Task Force. Initially, this group was really focused on tackling issues specifically in Thailand, but it was a consortium of retailers, governments, NGO, and academic partners that came together to try to tackle some of these kind of sustainability issues, so to speak. And through that work, they came up with this model for sustainability for shrimp. It had 5 things. It had to be transparent, meaning you have to be able to kind of track the supply chain, and you have to be transparent about what your impacts are. It should be conversion free. We'll talk about mangroves in a little bit. It should be traceable. It should be resource efficient, and it should respect like basic human rights. So I came into this environment as all of this was kicking off, and I got to work on 4 of these aspects, and I'll kind of share some of the work that I did in each one of these buckets. So we'll start with traceability. This is what my PhD was on. So starting with like kind of like why would you care about traceability? What's important? Traceability increases your accountability. It improves risk monitoring. So in other versions of this, I put up this graph of import refusals by the FDA, but every year, roughly like 10% of the products at the border are turned away for a variety of reasons, but the leading reasons are typically food health and safety. So that's a concern for consumers, but also environmental and social risks. You want to know what's going into your products and what's happening to make those products. And then also limits time and money on recalls. Like I said, those products at the border, when you get your products sent back, that's lost money. And then it increases confidence with regulation compliance. You want your consumers to feel good about the products they're buying. It's also important for claims making. So something we'll talk about later in the talk here are these certification standards or eco labels. Does anybody recognize any of these? Have you seen these before? Raise your hand. Yeah. So this one is pretty common in the US. This guy is less common. They're comparable, not the same. We'll talk about some of the differences, but these labels are making some kind of assertion about how a product was made and that you should buy it because it's better, right? And you need traceability to know that the thing in the bag actually meets the standards that that label is suggesting it meets, whether that be like environmental or social or kind of regulatory. And so WWF, or our working group at the time, kind of viewed traceability as sort of the key with aquaculture and unlocking, minimizing local impacts on biodiversity. So to put it plainly, if you want to go after the bad guys, you have to know where they are. And if you want to know where they are, you have to have traceability. This gets really complicated in shrimp supply chains. So shrimp supply chains are really disaggregated, especially at the producer level. There's millions and millions of shrimp producers. This is kind of a graphic that would sort of suggest kind of the scale of different parts of the supply chain. So we're talking about many, many fishing vessels that are contributing to the fish meal that's ending up in the shrimp feed. And then many, many farmers that are being consolidated by these guys called brokers. And these guys are really problematic in the supply chain. These are sort of like middlemen that work for the processing plants that go around and aggregate shrimp from different farms. And so when those guys buy, 100 pounds here, 1,000 pounds here, put them all in the back of their truck, we now lose that traceability component. So one of the things that we had to tackle when working with companies on this was how to deal with these brokers. But you can see that this supply chain is like not very vertically integrated, and it's very, there's a lot of actors. So expecting traceability within the supply chain can be difficult. Another practice that's particularly problematic in seafood and shrimp in general is called transshipping. And so what transshipping is if you have shrimp that are being grown in one country, they are sent to another country and packaged, and then label on that bag reads as if they are from that second country when they're sent somewhere else. So essentially the label doesn't match where they're from. Again, we're losing that traceability. This happens for a variety of reasons. Processors can be short on their contracts. Price differentials, shrimp from different countries are worth more than others. But this does happen. And so one solution that we investigated as a potential piece of evidence to help with traceability claims with elemental profiling. If you're in the fisheries world and you've heard of like otolith microchemistry, this is very similar. But the way this works is you take a bunch of samples with known origins, you analyze them for a suite of elements, then you run that through a statistical analysis, usually involving some kind of discriminant function like a random forest or a linear discriminant analysis. And then you have sort of this like database that is validated and you can use to test unknown samples. So you have this database that you build of known samples that serve as sort of a reference set, and then you can take unknowns and add them to that reference set. So I'll start here. The first like study I'm going to share is published in Food Control. And this was kind of like our attempt to build our reference set. So this was looking at how well can we discriminate elements between different production countries. And fortunately for us, most of the shrimp that are sold in the US and Europe come from one of five places. They come from Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Ecuador, or India. And so the shrimp trade itself is fairly consolidated in terms of where consumers are getting their shrimp from. And we know, based on some pilot studies that we had done and other work that's been published, that this should work in shrimp. Like elemental profiling has been done before, and shrimp in different geographic locations can have unique element profiles. So for this work, we sampled shrimp in 5 countries. I got to visit 2 as part of this work. I was supposed to go to Indonesia, but COVID had other plans. But we went to 5 countries and we sampled shrimp from the predominant shrimp production regions, analyzed them with ICP-MS for 42 elements. So that gave us like our data set that we're going to work with, and then use the statistical models to identify country of origin. So what we found was out of the 42 elements we analyzed, 33 were potentially usable, and we ended up with 28 that were statistically different, at least between 2 countries. Ecuador tended to have higher element concentrations. I'm not sure there's like a lot of significance to that, but it does play into it. Here, I'll show you what I mean in a second. And then we ended up using 16 elements in a random forest classification model. And so what you get out of these models are these, they're called confusion matrices. These are tables that kind of highlight where the model matches and doesn't match. So for example, we have our reference column here for Ecuador. And in Ecuador, 119 out of 122 samples matched as Ecuador. So we have really good accuracy there, 98%. Overall, our accuracy was 91%, and that's pretty strong for these. We see that Indonesia is most poorly classified, so we only had 76% accuracy in Indonesia, and frequently being classified as other Southeast Asian countries in Ecuador. And we see that Vietnam and Thailand are pretty similar, and they're getting confused for each other a lot. And so that's a result that matches previous results. It's not surprising. So we want to think about this and like, what does this mean, or how do these data relate to each other? It's really hard to think in 28 dimensions, so you can use ordination to crunch that down to 2 or 3 dimensions. And what we see kind of matches what we saw on the table there. So India is kind of off on its own island. Ecuador is kind of off on its own island. And then those 3 Southeast Asian countries, in the first 2 dimensions, it looks like they overlap a lot. When you add the 3rd dimension, it turns out they're kind of going in opposite directions. So Indonesia and Thailand are actually quite different in that 3rd direction. So this is kind of like a 3-dimensional, like a throwing jack almost. It's got legs coming off of it like a stool or something. So overall, we had a lot of success there. Our reference set worked pretty well. And the kind of unique contribution for us in this paper is that we found out that Ecuador is pretty unique compared to the other countries, which is important because Ecuadorian shrimp are considered like better than some of the Southeast Asian countries. And so they can fetch a price premium on the markets. And even though China is one of the world's largest producers of shrimp, they are actually the #1 importer of Ecuadorian shrimp because they're considered better than their domestic production. So if you can think back to that figure I shared with kind of the process of elemental profiling, this is our database now. We have this reference set that we can use to classify unknown samples pretty successfully. So the next part of the study was to go out and actually collect those unknown samples. So I made several trips in the US and the EU to go to grocery stores and collect retail shrimp products. And we were going to run those through our classification models. And this is published in Current Research in Food Science. But again, the background here is, again, we have that concern about transshipping and mislabeled products in general. It's pretty common in seafood. And we have seen that we can do elemental profiling with shrimp from farms, but we want to know if we can do it with retailers. This is kind of the leap that we were trying to make with our, with my PhD. And so I ended up sampling, we have our, I sampled shrimp in 5 or 6 countries, in like 20 something states in the US and 5 countries in Europe. Matching our countries of origin. So I only sampled shrimp that were supposedly are labeled as being from the countries that we had in our database. We did the same thing. We analyzed them for ICP elements. And then we used those classification models to see if we could classify them in country of origin. So for this project, I traveled to 5 countries in Europe, 26 states in the US, as well as Ecuador and India. I made sure to take advantage of my travels. So this is the Columbia River Gorge. This is in Utah. This is a Basilica in France. That's in Amsterdam. That's the Grand Canyon. So I made sure to take little detours while I was doing my trips. Just something to keep in mind if you're doing field work. Don't tell your advisor. But so what we found was out of the 42 elements that we were able to test, 24 of them were usable, 15 had statistical difference. We see again that Ecuador tended to have more mineralized element concentrations. We ended up using all 24 in our classification models. So we ended up doing 2 models for this study. The first one was basically the same process that we did for the country production. So we looked at, okay, well, if we trust the label, how well do the regions classify themselves? And you can see already, not as good. So already we're kind of in less of a good spot than we were with those farm samples. And you can see like some countries are just all over the board, like Vietnam, 42%, Ecuador, 67%. India is still pretty strong. And I will talk about that in a second. But so already the element profiles in the retail samples themselves are less consistent. And unfortunately, with these samples, you know, in the first model with the farm samples, we collected those shrimps from farms, so we know they're from those countries. So there's one source of error in the model, it's the model itself. Here, there's 2 sources of error. We can either have model errors, or we can have products that are actually mislabeled. And so in some cases, you can kind of tease that out. For example, nobody that's growing shrimp in Ecuador is claiming that their products are from Vietnam. They get more money being Ecuadorian. Kind of the same thing here, like nobody is going to label their stuff as Ecuador and have it actually be from, like they're not sourcing Indian shrimp and sending them to Ecuador. So you can kind of walk through this table and piece together that some of these are model errors. But when you get over to some of these countries in Southeast Asia, it gets more difficult to say, for example, if these samples here that are being labeled as from being Vietnam, but showing up as Thailand and Indonesia, it's difficult to say if that's the actual case. And especially this India column here, samples that are being labeled as Vietnamese, but are popping in our model as India. It's hard to say if it's model error or if it could possibly actually be transshipped. When we look at the ordination for that data, you can see that it's less kind of conclusive. We still have the samples from Ecuador kind of parsing out over here, but those 4 Asian countries are all kind of smack dab on top of each other. And if you were to compare the variation and explain, we're explaining less variation as well. Okay, so what the actual goal was to use the reference, the first study, those farm samples, to try to validate the retail samples. And this failed pretty miserably. So only 40% accuracy. And again, we can't really know like why a sample is being misclassified because there's 2 sources of error, but certainly some of it is model error. So we were kind of left with this study saying, not really sure if this was an appropriate tool for retail shrimp. So overall, the first model that we did with the retail shrimp was it was moderately successful, but it's not as strong as the farm samples. Couple reasons, it could be that there's more variation in size, but we're very consistent when we got our samples from the farms. The other possible explanation is the processing treatments. So when shrimp are bought and sold from a farm, they go to a processing plant, and typically they're exposed to some kind of mineral bath. Sodium metabisulfite, sodium tripolyphosphate, and sodium chloride are used as preservatives to help maintain the color and kind of the texture of the meat. So these shrimp are being exposed to these salt baths in the processing plants. And we actually see some evidence of this being a problem. So one thing that really points to these processing samples being different, or this processing having an effect, is that the sodium in the retail samples was about 5 to 6 times higher than the farm samples. So it seems like there's some difference in the elemental profiles. And we actually designed an experiment to test that, where we got shrimp from a commercial processor, pre and post processing, and we did see that some of these processing chemicals appear to be flushing out ions and replacing them with sodium, or increasing the sodium concentration. So that's an issue that we encountered on the elemental profile. So that was kind of like a crash course on 3 of the 4 chapters in my dissertation, and kind of what I was doing on the traceability side. I want to talk about some of these other buckets that I worked on next. So we'll jump over here to resource efficiency. This study is a meta-analysis that I did, and it's published in the Journal of Environmental Management. Really focused on kind of the land footprint of shrimp. So if we go back, again, about 40% of our land footprint overall is tied up in food production. So it's a pretty significant portion. And there's this kind of debate about how to do aquaculture. So commercial aquaculture exists on this continuum of practices, or from what's described as extensive aquaculture to intensive aquaculture. Extensive aquaculture, you might have heard like organic or low density, things like that. Essentially, you're using the natural production, the natural algae in the water to feed the shrimp. And so there's not really any inputs into the system, and your carrying capacity is about 1 metric ton, or about 2,000 pounds per hectare. So you're very limited in how much you can do there. Of course, folks want to get more production out of their systems. So on the opposite end, we have intensive aquaculture, where we're using things like aeration. We're using artificial feeds. We're using supplements like lime and probiotics to help improve the conditions in the ponds. And when we start doing those practices, we can get our carrying capacities up to 3.5 to 10 metric tons, or even higher. So on 1 unit of farmland, we're producing 4 shrimp. The kind of kickback to this is there's this big disparity in the amount of production and the amount of land use for farms in extensive versus intensive systems. So at the time that this particular study was published in 2018, about 13% of the world's shrimp production was done extensively. And that 13% of production accounted for almost half of the land in terms of ponds, so about 46%. So the question I wanted to ask was, can we produce more shrimp while conserving land? This is a relevant question because shrimp production is on basically a exponential curve. It's increasing every year. And so it's a relevant question because we're going to grow more shrimp, and we can decide how we do it, right? So you might be wondering what goes into a land footprint for shrimp aquaculture. Glad you asked. So when you're talking about an extensive system, the only real land input is the farm itself. So the land that the shrimp farm is occupying is the only land that's used for that shrimp to grow. When you're talking about intensive systems, you now have that land from the farm, but you also have something called embodied land from the feed. So if you're thinking about feed ingredients. One of the main feed ingredients from aquaculture feed is soy. And soy, it takes farmland to grow soy, obviously. Because we're feeding those shrimp soy, the land required to grow that soy is basically tied up in those shrimp. Like you can think of it like we're setting aside acreage just to grow shrimp feed, right? And so these two factors can kind of be modulated by a couple of things. The direct farm use is kind of set by the farm to pond surface area, surface ratio. So we have the actual pond area, and then there's a certain amount of supporting land. Usually it's about 1.3 times the pond itself is the total area of the farm. And then you can modulate the land footprint of a particular shrimp by increasing the production intensity. So for example, if you grow 1 ton of shrimp on 1 hectare of land, then your footprint is 1 hectare per metric ton. If you grow 10 tons on 1 hectare, your land footprint is 1/10 of a hectare per ton. So as you become more intensive, the per unit land footprint decreases. And then on the embodied feed side, shrimp companies are very secretive about their feeds. They consider them proprietary. So the best thing we can do is use an estimate with a constant because they're all about the same. And the way that gets modulated is by the food conversion rate. How many pounds of feed does it take to grow a pound of shrimp? We can be more efficient or less efficient, and that impacts how much land we're using for a particular pound of shrimp. So when we started doing these resources, when I was at WWF, we were out on farms doing surveys regarding resource use. And from these surveys, we were able to kind of model these land footprint relationships with production intensity. And it turns out they're logarithmic. And so if you plot them on the log 10 scale, you get this really nice linear relationship. And then you can say things like, because of the way the slope works, for every 10% increase in production, there's a 3.7% decrease in embodied land. So there's this decreasing relationship with land footprint and production intensity. At the same time, the relative ratio of farmland and embodied land also changes. So as we become more intensive, we're essentially displacing the land footprint of the shrimp into the feed. So if you think about like isolating the land footprints of the farm and removing that and putting it in a cornfield in Nebraska, that's kind of what you're doing. And so what I wanted to know is, could we use meta-analysis to model these relationships? So what I did is I did a literature search. And this paper was a product of a class I took at Auburn. But I did a literature search and I found papers that had the data I would need to estimate the embodied land and the land footprint for shrimp. Got them all in a consistent format, and then I used a meta-analytic kind of linear regression model to estimate beta coefficients and then get a working relationship between land and production. And so what comes out of this, apologize if you're colorblind. I know these aren't colorblind friendly, but you got individual slopes for each kind of study that I included. And then this big thick black line is the overall global relationship. So we end up with a global model. And again, we can rephrase that in a way that's easy to understand, where we say for every 10% increase in production intensity, there's a 3.2% decrease in land footprint. So this is a working average for all shrimp farms based on the data I was able to obtain. So now that we have these relationships, we can do some kind of cool things with them. So if we know our global production target and our desired land use target, we can calculate the production intensity. And then based on that production intensity, we can model how much of the land will be tied up in the farms and how much will be tied up in the crops. And again, remember going back to our kind of baseline scenario, only about 13% of the production is coming from extensive farms, but they account for about half of the farms in terms of total land footprint. So what I did was I created 4 scenarios. The first scenario for production expansion was business as usual. So I maintain the current ratio of extensive versus intensive. We're going to model growth. We're going to model going from, at the time, We used like 5 million as a baseline, 5 million metric tons. We modeled 7.5 and 10 million, so a 50% and 100% increase. Our next scenario was extensive only, so we're going to keep all the farms we have now. We're going to meet future production with extensive farms. Third scenario was intensive only, so we're going to keep the farms we have now. We're going to meet our goals with intensive production, but through farm expansion. So we're not going to intensify the farms we have now. We're going to create new and intensive farms at the same average production intensity that we have already. And then the last scenario was a no expansion scenario. So in this scenario, we're making no new farms, and we're going to increase production by increasing production intensity. And so what we get, if you're a graduate student, never put a giant table on a slide, but I'm going to break my own rule here. What we have is, so we have our estimate for total land use. And because we have that study where we calculated the farm footprint, we were able to compare our estimate from our model to what we see based on like government records and stuff like that. We were pretty close. So we know that this number is pretty accurate. We were like, I think within 10 or 20% of our estimate. So if we look at our scenarios, we have our kind of like what our new land use would be for each our business as usual case. And then we can look at what would happen if we use different practices to expand production. So if we use extensive farms, we're increasing our land footprint overall. So we're adding to the land burden of shrimp aquaculture. And if we use our other two methods, so this is intensive expansion only, but we're going to expand farms. We still have a net negative decrease in land use compared to our business as usual case. And if we do no farm expansion, but we're going to intensify our farms that we have now, we have an even greater decrease in land use. So those the use of those intensive production practices drastically would lower our overall land burden going forward. So this is just kind of a comparison of those columns in a graphical format. So you can see here that extensive system only scenario is really drastic in terms of the added land footprint that it would have compared to the business as usual case. So the kind of overall takeaway is that a lot of people consider these extensive systems low input, but the only reason you can call them low input is because you're not considering land and input. They're very land intensive. One question that came up while I was doing this is, okay, well, if you want to expand farms or expand production by intensifying, is that even practical? So we looked at what the average intensive production was at the time in like 2019. And then what we'd have to get to get to 7.5 million without no new farms and 10 million without no new farms. And both of those totals, 10 and 14, are within a reasonable range to expect a shrimp farm to produce in a year. And again, this is relevant. I looked in the FAO data just the other day, and in 2023, we produced 8.5 million metric tons of shrimp. So we've already blown past that middle target in just like 5 years. So just to kind of sum up this this work, moving these farms in an intensive direction displaces the land footprint from the coastal zone into like agricultural land. You can have arguments about whether or not mangroves are more valuable than say like a cornfield in Nebraska. That's kind of philosophical. It's not what I was trying to do here, but it's a question that I brought up. And then there's trade-offs with these systems. Intensive systems inherently lock certain actors out of the supply chain because they're not going to have the money and resources to upgrade their farms and add aerators and afford feed and all that stuff. So these intensive systems are exclusive for small shareholders. All right, I'm going to speed run these last two here. So this next topic I worked on was kind of conversion free or trying to minimize habitat conversion for aquaculture. This study focused on mangroves, and this paper was kind of an opinion piece. We didn't actually go out and collect any data here. we're just kind of making an argument. Mangroves are kind of controversial. When aquaculture started in earnest in the mid to late 80s, most of the farms were built in mangroves, and they very, very quickly realized that that was a mistake because mangroves have very acidic sediment, and basically it would just, after so many rounds of production, it would just nuke the farm. And these shrimp farms had massive die-offs. The first place to really have aquaculture was Thailand, and Thailand doesn't really grow shrimp anymore because they had these big boom bust cycles of die-offs from improper production practices in the mangroves. The other problem with mangroves, or the other kind of conundrum with mangroves, is that the folks that are still doing aquaculture in the mangroves are mostly small shareholders. So we're talking about like mom and pop farms that are raising shrimp, and in some places it's government mandated. They have to maintain a certain percentage of mangroves on their farms. So if we kind of zoom in on a place here like Vietnam, we look at this Can Tho province. What you see if you were to zoom in basically anywhere on the coast is something like this. These are all shrimp farms. This goes on for hundreds of miles up and down the coast of Thailand, Vietnam, China, India. It's really hard to like grasp the vastness of the scale of these if you haven't seen them in person, but these farms are ubiquitous on the landscape in a lot of these countries. And so this paper, like I said, this was more of an opinion piece, and it was kind of an argument about the efficacy of advocating for these mangrove aquaculture systems. So again, integrated mangrove aquaculture falls down here on this extensive part of the spectrum. It's argued for by a lot of NGOs because it's seen as more environmentally friendly. And the crux of the argument is that it requires little or no inputs and you still have mangroves. But again, I would like to posit the question, is land not an input? Because these farms use vast quantities of lands, specifically in mangroves. So integrated mangrove aquaculture is a form of extensive aquaculture where there's mangroves that are maintained in the ponds still. As I said, a lot of folks, if you read literature on these, they advocate for them and say they're supplying ecosystem services and they're more environmentally conscious than other forms of shrimp farming. But there's basically no empirical evidence that they would supply any ecosystem services that folks say they do. And they can only be managed extensively. So it would be basically impossible to try to intensify these to decrease the land footprint. But they're primarily used by small shareholders. In some places, they're mandated. They're a requirement to maintain mangroves on your shrimp farm. Again, we know from vast quantities of data that we collected at farms in multiple countries that there's these really strong negative relationships between per unit environmental footprint and production. So more intensive systems require less resources per unit of production. So these mangrove systems are less efficient. And the kind of key takeaway from this paper was this figure that we constructed comparing ecosystem services that an intact mangrove would supply, the kind of compromised nature of integrated mangrove aquaculture and kind of what that would look like. So these are some examples. And then the kind of comparison to a standard aquaculture farm. So we were making more of a kind of a philosophical argument about the value of these systems and the importance of protecting intact mangrove systems. In a lot of places in Southeast Asia, this is already kind of like, we already missed the boat on this. We have a lot of these systems, they're in mangroves. But in places like Africa, where there's a lot of intact mangroves and a lot of potential for new aquaculture, this is something that could be relatively important. And we really wanted to make an argument that environmental NGOs should be thinking hard about whether or not they should be advocating for these systems. Okay, and then the last piece that I got to work on was sort of this transparency piece. So this study compared kind of the technical efficiency of certified farms versus non-certified farms. So starting with this model here, if you think about environmental performance, there's going to be a distribution, just like any, randomly, normally distributed variable that you all work with. And generally speaking, we set government regulations to try to minimize the role of these bad actors. And then something that has developed in the last 20, 30 years are these voluntary standards that are supposed to reward good actors. So are we trying to prevent these guys? Are we trying to get people into this bucket over here is kind of the question. At the same time, consumers have become more aware of the environmental impact. More people have some feeling that they impact the world with their consumption, and people make consumption choices based on that. There's a market for sustainable products and products that are more environmentally friendly. And that depends on folks in the market being able to identify those products. We all know products that like use this to their advantage, things like Annie's, Tom's, seventh generation, or it might be some that you're more familiar with. This is called eco-labeling. It's a market-based solution that certifies products that meet certain standards. And these are shortcuts for consumers. You're supposed to be able to go to the market, see that little label on the bag or the bottle, and say, oh, I can buy this and it's not going to be a problem. Most eco labels are built on 4 basic principles. They need to be, the product needs to be environmentally responsible, socially fair, safe, and in the case of aquaculture, there's an animal welfare impact as well. And in the case of the certifications that WWF was part of setting up, which are the 3 on the screen here, there's a separation of powers. So the certification body is in charge of managing the certification and what the actual standards are. There's a third-party auditing agency that's responsible for going out and auditing the farms. And then there's the producer that is being audited. This is supposed to keep the certification body from being financially incentivized to weaken their standards. And these standards specifically were established through a collaborative process with academics, industry, NGOs, and governments. So there's compromises in all of them. They're not perfect. So what we wanted to know in this study are, do the ASC, the Aquaculture Stewardship Council standards reflect the best or the rest? Do we really see a difference in the technical efficiency of those companies or those farms? So what I was able to do, because ASC is transparent, I was able to pull up all their audits and scrape out the information I needed from their surveys that they publish on their website. Information about the size of the farm, the production intensity, how much feed they were using, what chemicals they were using, how much energy they were using. So I was able to get basic information about how they were running their farm. At the same time, WWF was collecting data from those 5 countries that we were working in and compiling farm surveys for our own purposes. So we had this data for regular farms and we were comparing it to ASC farms. I ended up lumping these by region, and part of the reason is aquaculture ponds in Southeast or in Latin America are generally much bigger. If you look at the scale here, the scale bar down here is 500 meters. So some of these ponds are over 1 kilometer in distance. So some of these are several square kilometers. These guys are about 100 meters in square. So they're much smaller. They use different production practices. So we lump them by region. Key differences that we saw, certified farms in Latin America were about 4 times the size of non-certified farms. And I know it looks like a smaller difference. It's actually bigger. Certified farms in Asia were about 10 times larger than non-certified farms. So we're seeing that the farms that are able to get certified are the big ones. And that's because certification is really expensive. So it's a financial burden. And then when we look at production intensity, again, we see that certified farms in Asia tend to be producing at a more intense level. So they're producing more shrimp on the same amount of land. And we don't see that difference in Latin America. So the kind of short answer here was, were ASC farms different? They tended to be bigger and they tended to be more industrialized. Were they more efficient? Not really. And in fact, the worst FCR, the worst feed conversion rate we had were Latin American certified farms. So our certified farms in Latin America were actually performing worse in terms of feed use than non-certified farms. There were a few things that were better. On average, ASC farms were more energy efficient and they tended to use less chemicals. So it's kind of a mixed bag. They weren't really that different from a technical standpoint. The other thing we looked at, because I had compiled a database of all ASC farms, I was able to add up their production and figure out how much of the global shrimp market was certified. And it turns out about 5% of the global shrimp market was certified at that time. So then begs the question, is 5% of the market enough to make a difference? So kind of again, trying to understand the value of these certifications because they are very expensive for the producers. All right, so in conclusion, shrimp supply chains are pretty messy. I hope that's clear by now. And certification, while imperfect, does provide a potential avenue to make better choices. And there's no consensus around some of these issues. So people are still working on this. It's not going to get any better. Shrimp aquaculture is not getting smaller, so these issues are not going away. And at the kind of the conclusion of my dissertation work, what I said in my summary was that if you were going to rely on trace elemental profiling as your one and only tool for traceability, you would not have great evidence, but it can be part of a puzzle that helps you build more traceable products. So it has limited use in a practical setting, but it is of some value. So I'm going to leave you with Arturo here, my friend from Ecuador that helped me sample shrimp, and ready to take some questions if you have any. Yeah.
Question, oh, sorry,
I have a hearing disability, so just speak up if
Okay.
while you're talking.
I'll project. Question about the methods for elemental profiling.
Sure.
Were all the samples processed in the same lab or were they processed in their country of origin?
Yep, so the general workflow was because we were getting samples from 5 different countries, what we did was we dried the sample basically at the site, and then all the samples were shipped to me. They were re-dried, and I ground them up into a homogeneous sample, and then we sent all those samples to a lab in New Zealand, who was one of those partners on the first slide, Oriteam. They're a company that does trace elemental profiling, like that's their line of work. And they got wind that we were doing this and were like, hey, you want to share? So they stepped in and helped us because all this happened in the middle of COVID. So if you can imagine trying to coordinate across 5 countries in the middle of COVID, it was a pretty big logistical hurdle, but we got it done. And so yeah, they have standardized methods that they use, and they handled all the analysis. Or all the chemical analysis. Yeah.
And going off of that, and you might have mentioned this, but is there any next steps to try to better link the store-bought shrimp to the farm of origin or try to make that match a little bit better?
Yep. So we have a study that's just got back our second round of reviews on. So they added a few more countries. They added Honduras, and I think China. And then the person I'm working with is also more versed in stable isotopes than I am. So some of the isotopes vary, I think hydrogen varies latitudinally. And so we can use that to kind of tease out where latitudinally it came from. And there's obviously differences between Ecuador, which is in the southern hemisphere, and like India, which is in the northern hemisphere. And then we kind of redid that processing study. So they got some more process samples and found the same issues. I think the next step would be to realistically, like a group like ASC is like really positioned to do this. They would have to go to processors that are certified and get post-processing shrimp and build your reference data set out of that and see if you get improved results. I don't know. It's like I said, we can't know for sure, because any sample we grab off the shelf at a grocery store, there can be 2 sources of error in the model, can be either mislabeled or misidentified by the model. So just trying to tease out like which ones might be error and which ones could actually be transshipped is kind of based on the circumstances. Yeah.
I saw a story a while back about how they're trying to kind of move some of this to like there's a spot in Minnesota where they're farming shrimp and stuff like that. And so I guess, is North America a relevant component of it at all? And is it merging it at all?
I think there's about well, let me take that back. the thing that's relevant in the shrimp supply chain from North America is that there's a handful of places that supply all the brood stock for shrimp in the world. About 20 years ago, they developed this thing called SPF larvae, specific pathogen-free larvae. So these larvae were certified to not have certain diseases, and most shrimp hatcheries got their brood stock from those places. So that's kind of the role that North America plays in the shrimp world. There's people that try to grow shrimp in recirculating systems. It's just not profitable because it's way easier to grow stuff in a pond. It's way cheaper.
So I briefly worked at the Georgia Aquarium for a while, and one of the big things that when you're working there that you like preach about is this like seafood savvy program, which is like supposed to educate like the general populace on more sustainable like seafood practices. So how would, in your ideal world, would you like relate your research to like getting it to the consumer on like that kind of general scientific education level?
You know, our work wasn't necessarily targeted at consumers, but what I would say is don't really like the Monterey Seafood Aquarium's approach.
Yeah,
or Monterey-based. Yeah, I'm not really a fan of like the stoplight approach. One thing that's hard to kind of get from the data I presented today, but is very obvious when you start looking at it, is there's these really a lot of variance in the amount of resource use within a country. So if you're saying that like all shrimp from Thailand are on the yellow list, like there's a wide variety of scenarios of how shrimp can be grown in one country. So I'm not really a fan of that model. I think the best approach is to you know, if you can afford it, buy ASC certified products. Those are hard to find in the US because a lot of companies don't want to pay for the licensing fees. But you know, generally speaking, the shrimp industry in Ecuador is kind of static. They're not what they've, you know, the damage is done, so to speak. They tend to have better control on their production systems. Like, I still eat shrimp. One of my favorite things, actually, but yeah, that's a tough question to answer. And honestly, coming out of all this work, this is kind of a mixed bag. Yeah.
I've been trying to figure out how to ask this, but you showed that figure of sort of the many different components of how shrimp goes from the farm
Yep.
to the store. So when you're modeling with these different trace elements, is there a way to incorporate, like, for example, India is a big country. I can imagine they do a lot of things in-house. I can imagine smaller countries may have to swap some of those production things. And so can you incorporate something like that into it?
I mean, in theory, these guys shouldn't really be moving products that much. Shrimp spoil pretty quickly. In a lot of these places, there's not quite the same level of infrastructure that we have here. So it's not like they're aiming to have these shrimp travel for long distances before being flash frozen. So a lot of these processing plants are like in and around the shrimp farms. So a lot of times they're not traveling more than like 20 or 30 miles to go to a processing plant. It's when they start like swapping stuff that's a problem. In smaller production countries don't really end up in the international trade. So like the next countries on the list would be like Mexico, like Myanmar, Honduras. You don't really see products from those countries very often. Yeah, Troy.
Because elemental concentrations, I'm guessing, if it was microchemistry, that's usually just a water signature. There's a lot of
Yeah.
literature that says diet doesn't really get incorporated in those. For shrimp, when you're doing whole bodies, is that a combination of water and
Oh
diet?
yeah, so I should have been, I kind of glossed over that. We were using muscle tissue because that's like the least common denominator. If you go to a shrimp store or a grocery store, you try to buy shrimp, all of them have their tail muscle, not all of them have their shells, not all of them have different parts. Basically no shrimp in the US are sold with their heads. So, yeah, we think a few times people have tried to like tease out like what's contributing to the elemental profile. And in the work that's been done, like sediments and water are very weakly correlated to the elements that end up in the shrimp tissue. But, you know, they're in a matrix with element concentrations that should be informed by local geology. So that variation should be coming from the local environment. Feeds are relatively homogenized. There could be some influence there, but when you're looking at a region, they're all kind of the same. So it should mostly be the local environment that's driving the change, but nobody's been really able to demonstrate that conclusively, including us or the people I've been working with. Yeah.
Has anybody looked into, you know, having any sort of additive to the feed that could go in there that could be like more of a smoking gun?
You know, they don't disclose that stuff. So it's hard to isolate an additive.
Well, I mean, on the management side of things, like if that was a regulatory side of things, if you, like, would that be something that you could recommend to help improve traceability?
I see.
Like, anybody done that sort of thing? I don't know.
No, not specifically. The problem is, again, it's really hard to grasp the scale of this unless you see it. There's literally millions of shrimp farms. And in a